Hi, welcome to our show. What we were doing, walk the talk at the Central Vista. Instead, we are doing sit and talk on the Central Vista issue. And as you know, we're doing a series of episodes. The whole issue of redevelopment of the Central Vista, right from the Rashtrapati Bhavan to India Gate along the Rajpath. As we have pointed out, many buildings are going to be torn down. A new parliament is going to come up. And today we are very fortunate to have with us Mr. Ram Rahman. Thanks, Ram, for joining our show. And let me also apprise you that Ram happens to be someone who not just inherits the DNA of Mr. Habib Rahman, who was the principal architect with CPWD, in fact, was brought by Nehru to construct the post-independence Central Vista buildings along the Central Vista. But also the intellectual who also inherits the intellectual DNA. Ram, I think straight away, if you have to start, you're taking.
No, I'm only smiling because he didn't design any of the buildings on Central Vista.
No, but apart from that,
Yeah.
but I saw in one of his interviews. He has a comment on the Central
Oh
Vista.
yeah. There's a lot on the building of New Delhi.
So we'll talk about that.
Yeah.
So the foremost question that I think which is really coming to the fore is that the government is actually propounding a theory that, look, we have to Indianize the Indian architecture. And one of the reasons that is pushing this whole redevelopment process is this Indianization of the architecture. And if I may ask, because we've done episodes even in the past where Lutyens' Delhi was considered to be quite syncretic to the Indian ethos because they left the British architecture in Calcutta. And of course, when Nehru was planning the development along the Central Vista and other buildings, that also contributed a lot to the creation and construction of new buildings. So, if we discuss all these three phases from the Lutyens to 1947 and then from the 1947 to the present era and this whole process of redevelopment, how do you really capture all this?
Well, you see, Delhi has an interesting architectural history because Shah Jahanabad, which was built by Shah Jahan, was the great medieval, post-medieval city, which was a very urban center. And east of that and, between that and Tughlaqabad, etc., were all the ruined 7 cities of Delhi. So it was scattered with ruins. There was a lot of open land. When the British decided to shift the capital in 1912, when they make that decision, after a lot of debate, etc., they figure on that Raisina hill, where that village was, down to the Jamuna, where they'll build their imperial city. And all of this you've already discussed with many of the historians and sociologists and architects in your series. But you see what happens with the building of CPWD building of Delhi, particularly the Central Vista, which is done by architects, a very handful of architects who had been trained in India. We only had 3 schools of architecture when India became independent. There were more engineering schools, that had been actually set up by the British. And New Delhi was built all by British architects. Some of these architects who remained in PWD had worked at that last phase with the British architects. So the buildings that you're talking about, like Shastri Bhavan, Udyog Bhavan, Nirman Bhavan, etc., were designed by architects like Deo Lalikar, who, as my father says, in this long interview which was done in 1989, he was the first chief architect after independence of the Central Public Works Department, after the British. Now, there's an interesting history to that because I'll quote from here, which is my father's narrative. Which
I
is
think this comes from an interview that he...
Yeah, this was an interview done by Moloy Chatterjee, who was a professor at the School of Planning and Architecture, and has been very involved in actually documenting the history of the building of New Delhi. So this is the quote. Nehru was disturbed by developments along Central Vista Deolalikar's bhavans did not appeal to him. Bilimoria's bhavans were under construction and Nehru was apprehensive. In those days, a national library and a national theatre were proposed along Central Vista. This was actually Lathian's plan, and it's a very important part that we should talk about the Central Vista, that crossing of what we then renamed Janpath and Rajpath. There was to be the National Archives, which was built by Lathians, and the theatre, which had been designed by Mansingh Rana, never got built, but that was incorporated into the Indira Gandhi National Centre. And on the other side was the National Museum, which was designed by Deolalikar. And that was 1950, I think finished in 54, 55. And that was very much taking the idiom of Lathians, but in Deolalikar's, own way.
So when you say idiom of Lathians, I mean, could you just define that?
Yeah,
Maybe
you
in
see
just
what
one single sentence.
Lathians devised for building Delhi. Now, at this time when New Delhi is being designed, the modern movement has already exploded in Europe. So you've got the Bauhaus has been set up, Walter Gropius, the Russian constructivists, the Dutch architects are all building highly modernist housing and office buildings. Now, what Lathians was doing was completely different from that. He was still harking back to a classicism, which was imperial. That was the whole notion that the British wanted to do, but the ambition was very great. Because Shoesmith, who was one of the architects, has a wonderful quote saying that what Lathians devised, which he called the Delhi Order, including for the columns and the detailing, it was actually the last gasp of the Italian Renaissance.
Oh, so the premise of the idiom is the Renaissance.
Yes, it is completely taking what Palladio started in Renaissance Italy, taking Palladio's classicism, and New Delhi was going to be the grand end point of that style. So the ambition was very, very big. So here, as I said, the National Library, the National Theatre were proposed along Central Vista. Rana's proposal was shelved and incorporated into the IGNCA. So Nehru set up a Central Vista committee in 1959 because he was so, concerned about the building of New Delhi, but in a very democratic manner. And he had brought these young architects like my father, like Kanvinde, to Delhi from different cities in India. It was a sort of mini art commission with Joglikar, Benjamin, Bilumoria, Kanvinde, Bijit Ghosh and myself amongst the members. Meetings were chaired by Dharamveera, then Secretary, Ministry of Works and Housing. We could not succeed in improving Bilimoria's bhavans because Joglikar kept insisting that the designs were final and construction had started.
So Joglikar is the chief engineer.
He was the chief architect
yeah.
at that time, after Deolalikar. The committee then turned down the proposal by Gill and myself for extensions to the National Archives. After the DUAC was formed, the Delhi Urban Arts Commission, of which my father was the first secretary in 74, the Central Vista Committee declined in importance. But it still exists and can put a spoke in the wheels of any Vista-related project should any of its members be so inclined.
I'm not sure whether the committee still exists or
well,
not.
Let's find out if the committee still exists. But this gives you an idea of, you see, Nehru did not override Joglikar or the minister, even though he was unhappy with the design of the buildings. Nehru functioned in a democratic manner. And where he could intervene in design terms, like with my father, with Rabindra Bhavan, he did. And helped, create a modernist idiom which was to his liking.
So, Ram, I mean, if you could just put it in a chronological form. These days we speak about chronology a lot. So it starts from the Renaissance to the modernist Nehru's views of modern India and of course modern Indian architecture, and eventually lands up here.
See, for instance, this is 1959. That's the Mazar of Maulana Azad. And this was built at a very historic site in front of the Jama Masjid. And what my father did is take the arch proportion from the masjid, from the entrance, and abstract it into this thin shelled cross-vault concrete. And Nehru loved this, and this was the kind of Indian modernism that Nehru liked, because it had a root in Indian aesthetics and in Indian building traditions, but was using modern material with a modern vision.
That's the photograph of Habib Rahman and Pandit Jawaharlal Nehru. So what is he showing?
Yeah, this was 1961. You see, when you're talking about the whole notion of Indianism or Indian style in modern architecture, Rabindra Bhavan is actually a key moment in that whole debate. Because the first building that my father did looked like an office building.
Which one?
Of Rabindra Bhavan. Okay. Now, these were being built to commemorate centenary of Tagore in 1961, and they were to be cultural centers. They were being built in all the state capitals. So they were to be libraries, theaters, performing arts centers. So this was the one in Delhi. And Nehru looked at the first model and got very upset. He said, this looks like an office building. And this doesn't look like what you have done with Maulana Azad's Mazar or Gandhi Ghat in Calcutta, which had an Indian idiom to them, but they were totally modernist buildings. You know, they were not pastiche that you just put a chhajja or something randomly on the building. So he forced my father to redesign it in consultation with Nehru, actually. And that ended up becoming Rabindra Bhavan. Oh, wow. Now, the material used in that building was very different from what he had done for the office buildings, which were quite cheaply built and quickly built at that time, because we had very limited resources, you know, in those first decades after independence. So this is a key moment because it also shows how focused Nehru was actually on architecture, architectural style, and urbanism.
He had that aesthetics of...
not just that, but you see, he even had a sense of the urban. He breaks down the western wall or the southern wall of Purani Delhi, which was still there at independence, to make the the business district, where the stock exchange comes up, the banks come up, Delight Cinema comes up. So that wall was broken down. Then he built Fleet Street, which is where all the newspaper offices were, ITO. Okay. Indian Express, Patriot, Times of India, you know, they were all based on that one street. And in that ITO area, he also set up all the new buildings for government, which were the University Grants Commission, Income Tax Office, you know, all the buildings which were needed for the new government to function were set up in ITO. Now, see, that's the difference between putting all that kind of building in Central Vista.
So Ram, before we move out, I think one of the reasons why we are at your place, I mean, we could have easily got you at the Central Vista, and which our viewers must know, is that this house is a treasure trove. So can you just dig into some of the
sure. So this is, you see these trunks that you see here. They're all filled with my father's and mother's archives.
Yeah. And let us also inform that your mother was the first Miss India.
Yeah, that's my mother, the photograph that my father took in Calcutta. And you see, this is the kind of, I mean, this is a very shoddy archive, but this is, this was an issue of Design magazine on the Delhi Zoo, which was designed by my father. But here you've got, you know, many of his buildings. These are all his photographs of the housing, some of the plans. That's Rabindra Bhavan, which was the key. So you see this kind of material, there's a lot of Delhi's history here. This is Curzon Road Hostels.
Great. Just to continue our discussion
Yeah.
at your house. I think this is something very important that our viewers must know. In fact, the country must know that the whole process of redevelopment has something to do with the political, ideological mooring of the government. And and that was very clear, as you have pointed out, from the Lutyens to the Nehruvian era,
Right.
and now to what is called the Modi era.
Right.
So, what do you deduce out of it?
No, I think you see these buildings we've been talking about,
Yeah.
Shastri Bhavan or Vigyan Bhavan, etc., which were built post 50s. They may not be great buildings architecturally, but these are buildings that we have grown up with.
Yeah.
So we have a cultural memory, and it becomes part of your city.
Livable history.
Yeah, it's a cityscape.
Yeah.
And many cities you don't have buildings which are necessarily great buildings, but they become lived in, people get used to them, you have grown up your whole life either going to the buildings or having pan outside, or they are there, they're familiar. Also Shastri Bhavan or Udyog Bhavan has those murals by Satish Gujral, which are very important art historically for that period, because that was when public art was being done. Now, you see, to destroy cultural resources like the National Museum and the Indira Gandhi National Center and replace them,
huge, by the way.
it's a huge space, to replace them with an office building is a complete disaster, because you're taking away, an important cultural resource which is for the people. And Indira Gandhi Center, you've got those open lawns where they have these cultural festivals, exhibitions all the time. You're going to remove that from the center of Delhi and put up these buildings which are identical blocks, which is a very fascist idea actually.
Now, just hold on.
Yeah.
So what you're trying to say is, from the Renaissance to the modernist Nehruvian era, which you said was quite democratic,
Yeah.
to a fascist outlook.
Yeah.
That's for the first time I'm hearing it. What does that mean actually?
Well, the whole notion of fascism, if you look at the history in Italy, particularly Germany, when they gained control, they went back to a classicism in architecture, which is very conservative. And there was this idiom that they developed, which was, like long, severe pillars, grand buildings which were imposing buildings. Now, from the plans that we see of Central Vista, you're going to get these identical rectangular blocks, which is going to be very,
So the grandeur of the...
No, and also they're all going to be identical. So you'll get like one after the other, these bureaucratic, office buildings, which are going to replace the, odd mixed architecture that developed after independence. Now that has a certain character of its own.
So it's
and it reflects actually a democratic spirit by having these different buildings which are in different styles, which are open to the public, the National Museum. Now the other thing is, when you're tearing apart the National Museum, where are you going to put all the art which is inside it for the time that the building is going to be torn down and a museum moved somewhere else? And this is highly valuable art, which even to take out of a cupboard to show somebody is difficult to do. And these issues, I think, of cultural memory and of a lived city which has a certain access to the public, especially for cultural events and library, cultural resources, you're eliminating that and making this a Babudam city, which is going to be cut away from any public access. And the other thing which I can't understand, there was a report in Times of India that they were going to build nuclear bunkers.
Yeah.
You know,
And a ground tunnel for the Prime
yeah,
Minister
now
to move,
obviously that's part of the program, but the funny thing is you put the president, the vice president, the prime minister, and all the babus in this one location in Delhi. So you just need one bomb. So even in security terms, it makes no sense, you know.
So Ram, I mean, you pointed to something very fascinating to us. I mean, the grand idea of exhibiting one's valor or I mean,
Power.
Power. Can you draw a parallel between Albert Speer, what he was trying to do for Hitler,
very
and
much.
what Bimal Patel is trying to do for our indigenous?
Well, I think it's a very obvious comparison, because you see Hitler, don't forget Hitler was a failed artist himself. You know, watercolorist and oil painter.
But I don't think our Prime Minister is a failed artist.
Well, no, but you know, failed artist is a very dangerous person because they're frustrated.
Our Prime Minister was
they're,
never an artist, by the way.
no.
Maybe he has many other skills. Yeah.
No, I think the equivalence with what happened with Hitler and Albert Speer, which you know, who became his kind of favored architect in Berlin, is very apt in this context, because, you know, again, Hitler wanted to project this whole notion of Aryan purity and Aryan power
That's very interesting.
through this very grandiose building project, which was harking back to ancient Rome. You know, the architecture is a theatre set to depict power. And Albert Speer worked on the stadium where the Nuremberg, where the you know, great sports events happened, the great Nazi rallies happened. And there's this amazing story that he designed it to be these rallies to happen at night, because it would hide the portliness of the Nazis with the night lighting.
Oh, that's interesting.
Yeah, so you know, this whole notion of projecting power through a grandiosity and sort of uniformity of building, as a, you know, these blocks going down, where is actually a fascist idea. Because, you know, a democratic architecture has its own
nuances.
Own nuances. Some of it is bad, some of it is good, but it is democratic. And it reflects...
It's very varied as well.
Yeah, it reflects that spirit of openness, of, you know, a little bit of jugaad, you know, happenstance. Now, to do these very linear buildings is actually an example of fascist control through architecture of urban space.
But tell me, Ram, I mean, the last thing that I want to know, I mean, are all uniform, I mean, all sorts of uniformity leads towards fascism? And B, if you would, I mean, this one single point, because Indian fascism ought to be different from the Italian fascism or the European fascism.
Yeah.
And here it has to be quite ingrained to the whole bunch of Hindutva ideologies, you know. So this architecture also has to come closer to that. I mean, do you have anything to say on that?
No, you see, this idea of Hindutva ideology, you can see that more in the new temples that are being built, like the Akshardham, etc. You know, we have a great tradition of temple building, including contemporary, which are...
But I've seen Bimal Patel's presentations, where he speaks about the triangle, you know, coming up instead of the circular parliament. It will be triangular, and he speaks about the three gods. I mean, the Brahma, Vishnu. So, I mean, don't you think? I mean,
well, you know, once you get into that, the funny joke is, you see, the triangle, apparently according to Vastu traditions, is not a good shape. And Jawahar Bhavan, which was built by the Congress, is a triangular building, and the Congress never moved into it because of Vastu issues. So if you're building a parliament which is triangular, you know, this Vastu issue is there. But you see, this whole idea of Hindutva building of Modi is a sort of misnomer, because partly what Modi is trying to do, you know, by tearing down the Hall of Nations, for instance, of Rajrewal, which was a great modernist structure in our history, and we couldn't save it, even though we tried for years to try and save it as a, you know, great cultural resource. and it didn't happen. You see, Modi's, when you read the language that they use, which is to build something iconic and world class. Now, his idea is to project, some sort of, fancy, modernist, glass covered, steel.
The era, yeah, the so-called.
Now, I think that actually is a very regressive, lower middle class attitude. Because you're thinking that something like that is a world-class building, whereas you're not thinking in terms of architectural. You see, when Nehru brought in
So
modernism,
how do you link it to the whole concept of fascism, I mean, that you pointed out?
well, in many ways, you see, fascist ideology is actually very simple. It is a question of controlling population through symbols which are either political or cultural or architectural, which are actually quite simplistic. So this whole notion that you build something which is grand and on a big scale and identical, that this projects, it's actually a very simple notion. And that is the unfortunate aspect of fascist ideology.
Thank you, Ram. I mean, thank you so much once again. And I think this is a new facet that has come to light. I mean, we spoke about the different facets, right, from Renaissance to the democratic construction of the Central Vista, and now to why the whole idea of redevelopment of the Central Vista is linked to the idea of fascism. Thank you so much.
Oh, you're welcome.
Yeah, thanks.